The command came like a stone thrown through glass. Hands. Behind your back. You've got 5 seconds before I put you on the ground. The voice belonged to a man who had never once in his professional life been told he was wrong. It carried that certainty the way some voices carry an accent not as a choice, but as a condition. It was the voice of a man who had decided in the 6 seconds between stepping out of his cruiser and reaching the edge of the gathering exactly what he was looking at and exactly what he intended to do about it. What he was looking at, from where he stood on the manicured grass of Millfield Memorial Cemetery on a gray Thursday afternoon in October, was a large black man in a charcoal suit standing at the edge of an open grave. The man's hand rested on the polished lid of a casket. He had not turned around when the command was given. He had not flinched. He stood the way a man stands when he has decided somewhere very deep in himself that he will not be moved by noise. The mourners turned. 53 people in dark clothes, their faces carrying the particular exhaustion of people who had been crying in waves since morning, turned toward the sound. Confusion first, then fear, then something that had no clean name. The cold collective recognition of a group of black people watching a white officer with his hand on his weapon approach one of their own at a graveside. Phones rose. Small glass rectangles caught the weak October light. The officer's name, according to the brass plate on his uniform, was Harlan. He was 34 years old. He had been with the Millfield Police Department for 9 years. He had received 3 commendations and 5 internal complaints, all of which had been dismissed. He had never in 9 years been told that what he was doing was wrong. He had every reason to believe this afternoon would be no different. What Officer Bryce Harlan did not know what he could not have known, because he had not looked at the man long enough to see past the suit and the skin, and the fact of the refusal to comply, was that the man standing at that graveside had in the course of 16 years of service sentenced 1,400 people in the county courthouse 3 miles down Route 9. He had written opinions cited in 4 circuit court decisions. He had presided over 2 of the most consequential civil rights cases in the state's recent history. He had done all of this from a bench in the United States District Court for the Southern District of Millfield, in a building that Harlan had driven past every working day of his career without once looking up at the name carved above the entrance. Before this day was over, Officer Bryce Harlan would not simply lose his badge. He would be escorted out of his own precinct through the same hallways he walked every morning in handcuffs, the same model, the same cold steel, past the same officers who had watched him bring this man in. None of those officers would be smiling. The precinct would be very quiet. The kind of quiet that settles over a place when everyone present understands at the same moment that something has broken that will not be repaired. But that was later. This was now. The October wind moved through the cemetery's weeping willows. The scent of chrysanthemums hung in the cold air. And James Caldwell, United States District Judge, 57 years old, stood with his hand on his son's casket and did not turn around. He had been awake since 4:50 a.m., not because the alarm sounded. He had not set one, but because sleep had been a country he was finding increasingly difficult to reach since the phone call 9 days ago. The phone call had come at 11:22 p.m. on a Wednesday. He had been in his study reviewing a motion. His wife Renata had answered. He had known from the sound she made a single truncated breath, like something had struck her in the center of the chest, that the world had changed. He stood now in the kitchen of their house on Pemberton Drive, in the particular gray of an October morning that had not yet decided whether to produce light. He was wearing an old cardigan over a white shirt. Not his robe, not his suit. Just the cardigan his son had given him 6 Christmases ago, the one with the small hole at the left elbow that Renata kept saying she would mend and never did. He was wearing it because it still smelled very faintly like the cedar closet in which it lived. and the cedar closet was near Darius's old room. And nearness was all he had left. He made coffee the way he had made it every morning for 30 years. Measured, precise, ground beans, filtered water, the correct ratio maintained by muscle memory, while the thinking part of his brain went somewhere else. The thinking part of his brain had been going somewhere else for 9 days. It went to a stretch of Route 12 at night, to the particular angle of a truck that had crossed the center line, to the 41 seconds between that crossing and the moment everything that made the future imaginable stopped existing. He did not let it stay there. He pulled it back. He had learned from the military first, then from the bench, that you could not operate from inside the wound. You had to feel it, acknowledge its dimensions, and then step back from it and function. He had given himself the wound. He had not given himself the luxury of being consumed by it. Not today. Today required a different kind of strength. Darius Caldwell had been 26 years old. He had been a high school football coach and a youth counselor at the East Side Community Center on Millfield's South Side, a neighborhood that the city's development plans had spent 2 decades carefully not improving. He had played college ball on a partial scholarship, graduated with a degree in social work, and walked directly into the hardest available job in the city. Because, as he had explained to James, with the particular patience Darius reserved for explaining obvious things to people who should already know them, the kids there don't have anyone who shows up consistently. So I'll be the one who shows up consistently. He had been showing up consistently for 3 years. His players called him Coach D. The kids at the youth center called him Mr. Darius. Their parents called him a blessing, which was a word James had heard applied to his son so many times in the past 9 days that it had stopped sounding like language and had become something else, a sound, a frequency, the particular vibration of a community grieving someone who belonged to it. Renata came into the kitchen. She was already dressed. Dark blue, not black, she had told him last night. She was saving black for the winter, for the long work of grief that would come after today's public ceremony of it. She moved around him with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had decided that her role this morning was to keep the household functional so that James could focus entirely on remaining intact. She handed him a mug without speaking. He took it. Their fingers touched briefly. Her hands were steady, and he drew from that steadiness the way a phone draws from a charger, silently, completely, with no drama about the need. She had chosen his suit. The charcoal gray lay on the bed upstairs, pressed and buttoned. Not black. Charcoal. She had explained it last night, her voice soft in the dark of their room. Black is for endings, James. Charcoal holds the memory of the fire. He had not argued. She understood something about cycles and weather, that he, with his legal mind and his binary habit of analysis, was still learning to comprehend. She was a gardener. She had always known that loss was not an end, but a change in form. He was beginning slowly and painfully to try to see it that way. He drank his coffee. He looked at the kitchen window. Outside, the oak tree in the backyard had gone mostly amber, its leaves beginning the slow, inevitable descent. Darius had climbed that tree at age 7 and gotten stuck 15 feet up and refused to admit he was scared. James had stood at the base for 40 minutes, talking him down one branch at a time, not with urgency, but with the calm, specific instructions he used in the courtroom. Left foot. The branch just below your left foot. Don't look down. Just the branch. He did not let himself stay with that memory either. He rinsed his mug, placed it in the rack. Ordinary acts. He clung to the ordinary because the ordinary was the only evidence the world still contained that regular life was possible. Upstairs, he dressed carefully. The suit fit well. Renata's eye for these things was precise. He stood before the mirror and looked at himself for a moment. 57 years old. The gray at his temples had arrived gradually enough that he had stopped noticing it, but he noticed it now. His father's face was in his face, The same broad forehead, the same set of the jaw. His father had buried 2 children. James had asked him once, long after the fact, how a man survives that. His father had taken a long time to answer. "You don't survive it," he had finally said. "You carry it. There's a difference." He straightened his tie. He went downstairs. He said to Renata, who was standing in the hallway with her coat already on, "It's time." She nodded. She took his arm. They went out together into the gray October morning to say goodbye to their son. The church was full to the walls and past them. People stood in the vestibule and along the sides of the pews. They crowded the doorway. Several of Darius's former players, young men now in their early 20s. Some of them broad-shouldered and visibly uncomfortable in suits they had borrowed or bought specifically for this day, stood along the back wall with their hands clasped in front of them, and their faces doing the complicated work of holding grief and dignity in the same expression simultaneously. James and Renata sat in the front pew. The casket was ahead of them, closed. Renata had made that decision, and James had agreed immediately without discussion. He wanted to remember Darius in motion. Darius was always in motion on the sideline on his feet, one hand raised to call a play, the other pointing out something in the middle distance that only he could see yet, but that he was already certain everyone else would see in a moment. That was the version of his son James needed to take forward with him. Not the stillness. The eulogies were numerous and varied, and each one landed in James's chest like a stone into deep water, small, specific, and sinking slowly. A high school player named Marcus Webb, 19 years old, came to the lectern and immediately lost his composure. He stood there for a full 12 seconds, with his hands on either side of the podium, breathing, while the congregation waited with the particular collective patience of people who understand that grief is not performed on schedule. When he found his voice, he described the night Coach D had driven 40 miles at midnight to a neighborhood Marcus should not have been in, had found him, had not yelled, had not lectured, had driven him home in silence, and then in the driveway before Marcus got out of the car, had said simply, "I'm not doing this because it's my job. I'm doing this because you matter. Don't make me do it again." Marcus never made him do it again. He said he would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of that 40-mile drive. James held Renata's hand and did not look away. His nephew Calvin, 19 years old, Darius's cousin and closest companion through childhood, sat immediately behind James and Renata. He was a quiet young man with his uncle's same habit of stillness, the kind of stillness that is not passivity, but readiness. He had his phone in his jacket pocket. He had put it there when they arrived at the church, moved by some instinct he could not have named, and it had not moved since. The procession to Millfield Memorial Cemetery was long. 17 cars, headlights on in the middle of the day, moving through the city's streets at the particular reduced speed of grief that makes ordinary traffic part for it. James drove following the hearse. He kept both hands on the wheel. He counted traffic lights. He made his breathing even. They passed the East Side Community Center on the south route. Someone had put a photograph of Darius in the front window, large and printed in color, surrounded by the handprints of children in painted paper. James saw it for approximately 2 seconds as they drove past. He looked back at the road. At the cemetery, the sky had gone completely gray, the light diffused and directionless, the kind of light that removes all shadows. The pastor said the final words over the grave, the old words, the ones that have been said over graves for centuries, and that still mean something because they have survived that long. The casket was lowered. The mechanism moved slowly. Renata's shoulders shook. James held her, his arm around her shoulders, and felt the movement of her grief, and held himself steady against it, so she would have something to lean on. People came forward afterward, a quiet procession of hands and faces. "I'm so sorry, Judge." A hand on his arm, a whispered assurance, the inadequate but earnest gestures of community love. He accepted each one with a nod. He felt hollowed in a way that was different from grief, a structural hollowness, a building with a load-bearing wall removed. Calvin stood slightly behind him, as he had stood all day, silent, watchful, his hand near his jacket pocket. It was then that the gravel crunched. The sound was wrong. That was the first thing James registered before he had processed any of the specifics. The sound was wrong. Gravel beneath tires, moving too fast for a cemetery. The crunch of it was sharp and intrusive in the particular silence that follows the end of a graveside service, when people are still finding their footing back in the ordinary world. Several conversations stopped mid-sentence. Every head turned. The patrol cruiser had pulled onto the narrow access road that ran along the east side of the cemetery. It had come in without slowing at the entrance, and it stopped at an angle, two wheels partially on the grass. That was not the angle of a vehicle that had stopped for a reason, but of a vehicle that had stopped because it had arrived somewhere and the driver was already focused on what came next. Two officers got out. The one who stayed by the car was younger, maybe 28, with an expression that was trying to settle on the right emotion and hadn't found it yet. The one who walked toward the gathering was not trying to settle on anything. He had already settled. He was 34 years old, wide through the neck and shoulders, with the kind of physical confidence that comes from having been the largest person in most rooms for most of his life. He walked with a particular swagger, not aggressive in the theatrical sense, but purposeful in a way that communicated in every step that he had both the authority and the intention to be exactly where he was. His hand rested on the butt of his holstered weapon, not reaching for it, just resting, the way a man rests his hand on something he owns. James saw him coming across the grass and felt a recognition that was not about this specific officer, but about a pattern he had encountered in 200 case files, in 40 civil rights hearings, in the testimony of dozens of people who had sat across from him in his courtroom, and described in careful and shaking detail what it looked like when a certain kind of authority decided it was not going to be questioned today. Officer Harlan stopped at the edge of the gathering. His eyes moved across the assembled mourners with the particular quality of a scan that is not looking for information, but for confirmation of a conclusion already reached. He found what he was looking for in the aggregate. A large gathering of black people in a place he had decided in the 6 seconds of his drive across the parking lot was generating a problem. "We've had a complaint," he announced. His voice was unnecessarily loud enough to be heard clearly by everyone present, loud enough to establish from the first word that this was not a conversation between equals. Disturbance of the peace, loud music, and an unlawful assembly. A murmur moved through the crowd, not angry yet confused, genuinely, purely confused. There was no music. There had been no music. The only sounds in that cemetery in the minutes before Harlan's cruiser appeared had been the soft weeping of Darius's grandmother in the front row, the rustle of the wind through the willow trees along the perimeter, and the distant mechanical hum of a lawnmower somewhere on the far side of the grounds. The gathering was a funeral for a 26-year-old man who had dedicated his short life to building something better in this city. It was permitted, organized, and attended by people who had come to say goodbye. None of that, James understood immediately, was the point. The point was not the complaint, which almost certainly did not exist in any meaningful form. The point was the walk across the grass. The point was the hand on the weapon. The point was the voice pitched to carry over 53 people as if they were an obstacle to be dispersed rather than a family burying its dead. Reverend Arthur Gaines stepped forward. He was 71 years old, with the particular physical presence of a man who has spent decades being the largest moral weight in whatever room he occupies. He moved with the careful deliberateness of age and dignity, and he put himself between Harlan and the casket, and he spoke in a voice that was differential in its tone and absolute in its content. "Officer," he said, This is a private funeral service. We are laying a young man to rest. There is no disturbance here. Harlan looked at him. The look lasted approximately 1 second, the time required to scan and dismiss. I don't care what it is, Harlan said. I have a complaint. Loud music, unlawful assembly. You've got 10 minutes to clear this area. The order dropped into the gathering like something thrown from a height. 10 minutes. Clear this area. At a burial. Over a grave that had not yet been filled. James felt the heat begin. Not at the surface, not in his face, but somewhere deeper, somewhere structural. He had spent 16 years on the bench, containing that particular heat, converting it into the cold fuel of precision. He had learned that rage, however justified, was a weapon that destroyed the hand holding it. He had written that sentence in different forms in a dozen opinions. He believed it completely. He also believed with equal completeness that what was happening at the edge of his son's grave was not going to stand. James stepped forward. His movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely legible. The movement of a man who has been trained and has trained himself to give no one any reasonable cause to escalate. His hands were visible. His face was composed. The composed face cost him something in that moment that he would not calculate until later. Officer, he said. His voice was measured. A judge's voice, not commanding but carrying. The voice of a man accustomed to being heard in large rooms without raising it. I am James Caldwell. This is my son's funeral. We have a permit from the city for this gathering. He paused 1 beat. There has been no loud music. There is no disturbance. He had used his name only, not his title, not his position. He was not here to pull rank over a grieving father's burial, to weaponize his authority for his own comfort. He was a man asking for the basic human decency of being allowed to bury his child in peace. He reached slowly into his inside jacket pocket, announcing the movement. First, I am reaching into my jacket pocket to retrieve the burial permit and produce the folded document. He had filed it himself 3 weeks before the accident, when Darius had still been alive, and the future had still been a place James could imagine. He had checked every requirement, confirmed every signature, verified the cemetery's filing with the city clerk's office, directly because that was the kind of thoroughness James Caldwell applied to everything that mattered to him. The permit was complete, signed, stamped, and entirely in order. He held it out. Harlan's eyes moved to the permit. He reached out and took it from James's hand, with the grip of a man who has decided the document is a formality he is choosing to engage with, rather than an authority he is required to respect. He looked at it for approximately 2 seconds, long enough to see that it was a document, not long enough to read a single line of it. Then he dropped it. He did not let it fall by accident. He did not release it with distraction or carelessness. He took it between his thumb and 2 fingers, turned his wrist, and dropped it onto the grass with the deliberate, unhurried contempt of a man communicating something that words would be too direct to say. The gasp that went through the crowd was involuntary and collective. The sound a group of people makes when they see a line crossed that they had not believed would actually be crossed. Renata, standing 6 feet behind James, made a sound he had never heard from her before. Reverend Gaines went very still. Calvin's hand moved to his jacket pocket. Harlan looked at James. That means nothing to me, he said. Clear this area. 10 minutes. James looked at the crumpled permit on the grass. He looked at it for a full 3 seconds. He thought about picking it up. He decided against it, not because the act was beneath him, but because doing so would mean breaking the stillness that was at this moment the only thing he had left. He looked back up at Harlan. You are interfering with a legally permitted funeral service, officer, he said. His voice had not changed. It was still measured, still carrying. But something had entered it that had not been there before. Not anger, which is hot, but something much colder. The temperature of a judicial finding. The tone he used when he had made a decision from the bench that would not be revisited. I would advise you very carefully to consider what you do next. It was not a threat. It was a statement of consequence, a factual assessment of trajectory. It enraged Harlan in a way that no outburst could have, because it did not give him what he wanted: the escalation, the raised voice, the evidence of aggression he could cite in his report. It gave him instead the clear-eyed steadiness of a man who was not afraid of him. And for Harlan and James's experience with this particular type of authority, that was the unforgivable thing. "Are you threatening me?" Harlan's voice went flat. "That's it. You're under arrest. Obstruction." Harlan's partner Shepard, still by the cruiser, heard this. He took one step forward, then stopped. His face had gone through something in the last 2 minutes that he would not be able to articulate until much later. A kind of slow, accumulating wrongness, the way a floor feels before it gives way. He stopped. He stood. He watched. Harlan was on James before James had finished processing the word arrest. He grabbed James's left arm and wrenched it behind his back in a single twisting motion that was not a restraint technique, but a punishment. The kind of force that is applied not because it is necessary, but because it is permitted, because the uniform makes it permitted, because no one in the career of Officer Bryce Harlan had ever stood in front of him afterward and made him account for it. Pain shot up James's shoulder, sharp electric, the kind of pain that announces structural complaint. He absorbed it without sound. He did not pull away, did not resist, did not give Harlan the footage he was clearly trying to generate. He complied with his body entirely and fought with only his voice, and he pitched his voice to carry across the cemetery to every phone that was now raised and every pair of ears that was now straining. "I am not resisting," he said. Clear, measured. His voice was not raised. He had the vocal control of a man who had spent 16 years ensuring that every word spoken in his courtroom was audible and on the record. "You are arresting me without cause. You are arresting me at my son's graveside. I am complying fully. I am not resisting." Renata cried out his name. The sound of it, James, cut through the cemetery air in a way that nothing else had. Not the gravel, not the commands, not the gasps. It was the sound of a woman who had spent 31 years in a partnership that was the structural center of her life, watching the center be seized by a stranger with a badge. The family surged forward. Darius's grandmother reached toward James, her small hands outstretched. Marcus Webb, the young player from the front of the church, stepped forward with his jaw set and his fists clenched, and stopped himself. Physically, stopped himself with the terrible self-discipline of a young black man who knew with his whole body what happened when young black men stepped forward. Others shouted. The sound rose. Shepard moved in from the cruiser, not toward James, but toward the crowd. "Back up," he said. "Everyone back up." His hand was on his weapon. His voice had the flat quality of a man reciting a script whose meaning he no longer entirely endorses. In the chaos, James registered a small detail through the wide-angle clarity of a mind under controlled pressure. Calvin had his phone up, not shaking steady. His face was pale beneath the October sky, but his hand was absolutely steady, and the phone was aimed at Harlan with the precision of a young man who had been waiting without knowing he was waiting for exactly this. Good, James thought. Good boy. Document everything. Harlan fumbled with his handcuffs, the fumbling of adrenaline, the physical tell of a man who is performing certainty while feeling something closer to the alarm of a decision already made and already possibly wrong. He got them around James's wrists. He pulled them tight, too tight. The metal bit. He shoved James forward away from the casket, away from Renata, away from the grave of his only son, toward the cruiser parked with its 2 wheels on the grass of a cemetery where no police cruiser should have been driven in the first place. As he was walked past the grave, James looked at the casket one time. Just once. He allowed himself exactly that 1 second of looking at the polished wood, the brass handles, the spray of white chrysanthemums placed by Renata that morning. 1 second of the totality of what it contained. Then he looked forward. He did not look back. They were not just violating his grief. They were placing their boot on the memory of a 26-year-old man who had spent his short life trying to make the city better for the people those officers were supposed to protect. That was the line. James felt it cross through him like a current, not rage, not despair, but the cold and absolute arrival of a decision. This would not be ignored. This would not be privately settled or administratively processed and quietly buried. This would be answered in full in public on the record, in a venue that Harlan had never once considered when he dropped that permit on the grass. The ride to the 4th precinct took 11 minutes. James counted them. He also counted the streets they passed, 6 turns, 3 traffic lights, 1 railroad crossing. He was making the map of the route in his head, because making maps was what his mind did when it needed to stay functional, and the alternative was not functional. He had done this in the military. He had done it in the early years on the bench, when cases involved testimony that was graphic and required him to remain composed while absorbing details that would find him later in other hours, in other rooms. He had a technique for it. He used the technique now. Harlan drove. He said nothing to James directly. He spoke into his radio, however, with the measured confidence of a man constructing a record he believed would stand. Uncooperative male in custody, resisting arrest at the scene. Hostile crowd, approximately 50 individuals. Scene contained. He described Reverend Gaines's quiet differential request as aggression. He described a permitted funeral as an unlawful assembly. He described James's calm, audible compliance as non-cooperation. James listened to each sentence with the attention of a man who has spent 16 years evaluating the quality of narratives under oath. He noted the specific falsehoods. He noted the specific word choices. Hostile crowd. Uncooperative male. Resisting. He stored each one. The 4th precinct was a low brick building with peeling paint around the entrance and a row of cruisers in the lot that had the anonymous institutional uniformity of things that were meant to be identical and therefore interchangeable, and therefore in some sense unaccountable. Harlan pulled into the side entrance, the one that bypassed the main lobby, the one used for processing rather than for the public business of a police department. Not the front door, the side door. James was walked through a corridor whose linoleum had been buffed so many times it no longer reflected light so much as absorbed it. He passed 2 officers who watched the procession with expressions ranging from indifference to something that might have been amusement at the margins. No one spoke. No one questioned. A well-dressed black man in handcuffs being walked by a white officer in a precinct hallway was not a scene that generated questions. In the booking room, a bored officer with a thick gray mustache processed him from behind an elevated desk. James's wallet was removed. He saw for just a moment the embossed corner of his judicial identification card as it disappeared into the plastic property bag. The booking officer did not look at it. Harlan, who was standing 3 feet away, looked at it. He recognized it in the way that a person recognizes something they are choosing not to acknowledge. He sealed the bag. His tie was taken. His belt. His shoelaces, the small, calculated inventory of dehumanization items, removed not for any security purpose that applied to a 60-year-old man in a charcoal suit, but because the removal of them is part of the process, and the process is part of the message. You are not what you think you are. Here you are, what we say you are. He was photographed. He was fingerprinted. The black ink was cold on his fingertips. Through all of it, he said nothing. He cooperated with each instruction with the precise minimal compliance of a man who understood that every interaction was now evidentiary. His composure was not pride, though it looked like pride. It was strategy. And underneath the strategy, held very carefully in a part of himself that he had organized and sealed off for use later, was the grief, not the legal injury, not the civil rights violation that he was already with, the part of his mind that never entirely stopped working, beginning to structure into causes of action, but the raw personal grief of a man who had spent this morning saying goodbye to his son and was now standing in a precinct booking room with ink on his fingers. The holding cell had the concrete bench bolted to one wall, a stainless steel fixture in the corner, and a fluorescent light that produced a sound approximately 3 tones below silence. The door closed. The sound of it was final, in the particular way that doors are final in institutional spaces, not a slam, but a clank, the sound of a mechanism doing its function. James sat on the bench. He gave himself 3 minutes. He set the time in his head, the way he set time for anything specifically deliberately, with a defined end. For 3 minutes, he allowed himself the full dimensions of what was happening. The weight of the handcuffs still on his wrists, now removed, but still present as sensation. The crumpled permit on the cemetery grass. Renata's voice saying his name. Darius's casket receding as he was walked away. The 11-minute ride through streets he knew as well as his own kitchen in the back of a police cruiser that smelled of stale vinyl and cheap air freshener, while Harlan constructed the false record of an event that had not happened. 3 minutes. Then he opened his eyes. He straightened his spine against the concrete wall, and he began to build the case. Obstruction of justice, he thought, requires a lawful order as its predicate. There was no lawful order. The gathering was permitted. The permit was valid. Harlan's demand to disperse was without legal basis. Therefore, the predicate does not exist. Therefore, the charge does not exist. A charge of resisting a lawful arrest requires as its predicate a lawful arrest. There was no lawful arrest. The arrest itself is the illegal act. Therefore, he went on like this, methodical, complete. The way he had built every opinion he had ever written from the foundation up, with no assumed conclusions and no gaps in the logic. Fourth Amendment violation seizure without probable cause. First Amendment violation, the right of peaceful assembly for a lawful purpose with a valid permit. Battery, the arm wrenched the metal too tight, the physical force applied without justification. Civil rights violation under Section 1983. He had written opinions on every one of these categories. He had written some of them into the law of this district. He was now, for the first time in his career, on the inside of the machine he had spent 16 years trying to make run correctly. He felt the grinding teeth now. He understood them differently. Renata Caldwell had never in 31 years of marriage sat in a police precinct waiting room, and she sat in one now with the composed fury of a woman who had been a high school principal for 22 years and had therefore spent decades applying the specific skill of remaining functional while bearing witness to injustice in institutional settings. She had made 2 calls in the 9 minutes between the cruiser leaving the cemetery and her reaching the precinct. The first was to Diana Welch. Diana was 44 years old, partner at Welch and Associates, and one of the 3 or 4 people in the state whose name, when spoken in a courthouse, caused opposing counsel to take stock of their preparation. She had clerked for James 15 years ago in her first year after law school. She had been 29 and almost unbearably sharp, and possessed of a moral seriousness that James had recognized immediately as the kind that does not diminish under pressure but intensifies. He had written her a recommendation for every position she applied for after her clerkship. He had watched her build her practice. He was the closest thing she had to a mentor, and he was also, when pressed, the closest thing she had to a father figure, and she did not separate those 2 things. When Renata called, Diana was in her car in the parking structure of a downtown office building. She had the call on the second ring. Renata told her in 45 seconds, and with complete accuracy, exactly what had happened. Diana said, "I am already driving." She arrived at the 4th precinct 38 minutes later, with a leather briefcase that she had packed in her car, because she had learned over 14 years of practice that you keep the emergency documents in the car. In the waiting room, she sat next to Renata. She placed one hand briefly on Renata's forearm, not a gesture of comfort exactly, but of alliance. Then she opened the briefcase and began to work. Calvin sat in a chair by the window. He had not posted the video. He had sent it, the full 11 minutes and 47 seconds of it, to his own cloud backup, then to his mother, then to a second account. And then he had texted Diana's number. Renata had given it to him on the drive over with a simple message. "I have video of everything. Tell me what you want me to do with it." Diana had replied in under a minute. "Do not post anywhere. Do not delete. Charge your phone. I'll see you soon." Inside the precinct, the video was already circulating. It had been posted by 3 of the mourners independently before Diana's instruction arrived. Not the full footage, but clips of 30 seconds to a minute. The specific 30 seconds that included the permit being dropped, the grab, and James's clear verbal statement of non-resistance. Those clips had been shared by a local journalist's account within 40 minutes of the arrest. By the time Diana walked through the precinct's front door, the clips had a combined 340,000 views. Lieutenant Gary Pollard, 51, had been called at home and had arrived at the precinct in his personal vehicle, which told James nothing about his urgency and everything about his priorities. He had come in his own car on his own schedule as a choice rather than a summons. He reviewed Harlan's arrest report at the duty sergeant's desk with the expression of a man reading a document he has already decided to agree with. He closed the folder. He told the desk sergeant to process the arrest normally. He said, "We let the system work." The irony of that sentence, deployed in that context, was the kind of thing James would have noted in a judicial opinion and then set aside. He noted it now and set it aside. Pollard had backed Harlan 4 times previously. Complaints filed. Complaints dismissed. Signatures on dismissal forms. A pattern not yet fully visible from where James sat on a concrete bench in a holding cell, but beginning to take shape in the part of his mind that was always even in grief, even in handcuffs, building the picture from the available evidence. Diana filed the preliminary motion for release at the duty sergeant's desk at 4:47 p.m. The motion was 14 pages. She had written 6 of them in the precinct waiting room. The motion argued in order no probable cause for arrest, valid permit establishing lawful assembly, video evidence directly contradicting the arrest report, and violation of the 4th and 1st Amendments of the United States Constitution. It was submitted to the duty sergeant, the shift commander, and by email to the county district attorney's emergency line simultaneously. The precinct's own legal advisor, a civilian attorney named Ken Marsh, who had worked with the department for 11 years and had a functional, if not passionate, commitment to the institution, not destroying itself, watched the first clip on his phone at 4:52 p.m. and immediately called Pollard's direct line. The call lasted 4 minutes. James was not present for it. He heard about it later in the reconstruction that Diana assembled over the following days, like an investigator building a timeline. The substance of it, as best it could be reconstructed, was Marsh telling Pollard that the video created a problem that the arrest report did not solve, that the motion Diana had filed was legally coherent and would be difficult to resist in any hearing, and that the department had a calculus to perform between the cost of releasing the man now and the cost of what came next if it did not. Pollard made the call at 5:31 p.m. James was released at 5:34 p.m., 3 hours and 40 minutes after the handcuffs had closed at the Graveside. He walked through the front door, not the side door, the front door, the public entrance, because Diana had specified this when she arranged the release, and Pollard's people had not thought carefully enough about the significance of the distinction to push back on it. He walked through the front door of the 4th precinct of the Millfield Police Department in his charcoal suit, carrying his belongings in a clear plastic bag, with the particular composure of a man who has been in difficult rooms before and has never once let a difficult room determine his carriage. Renata was standing in the waiting room. She was across the room from him, and then she was not across the room. She moved the distance between them, in the time it took James to take one breath, and then her arms were around him, and his face was in her hair, and he felt for the first time since the handcuffs closed, the first real crack in the architecture of his containment. Not a collapse. A crack. A single structural shudder that he allowed for exactly as long as she held him, and then he found himself again. Diana stood slightly apart watching. She was holding her briefcase in one hand and a legal pad in the other, and her expression was the expression of a woman who had just seen with complete clarity the exact shape of what needed to be done next. Calvin stood by the door. He looked at his uncle and did not say anything. He looked at him the way young people look at elders when they have witnessed something that has permanently altered their understanding of what elders carry. Then he held the door open, and they all went out. In the parking lot, James stopped. He turned and looked at the building. He looked at it for a long moment. The low brick facade, the peeling paint, the institutional flag. He filed the image precisely in the part of his mind where he kept things that would be needed later. Then he got in the car. Renata drove. He sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window at the city moving past the ordinary Thursday evening of a city that did not know what had happened at a cemetery that afternoon, and would know it very soon. That night at the dining table with the dinner Renata had made sitting largely uneaten between them, James pulled a yellow legal pad in front of him and uncapped a pen. He wrote at the top, in the precise block letters he used for case notes, Caldwell versus Millfield, PD et al., preliminary case structure. Darius's youth center jersey was still on the coat hook by the front door. James could see it from where he sat. He looked at it once, registered it, and went back to the legal pad. The work was the grief. The grief was the work. He wrote for 2 hours. Diana arrived at 8 a.m. the next morning, carrying a portable printer and 2 thermoses of coffee, because she knew from long experience that war rooms require hydration and output capability, and that neither should be assumed to exist in sufficient quantity at the site. She sat up at the dining room table. James sat across from her. Renata moved between the kitchen and the table, bringing food that James ate without quite registering, because his body needed fuel, and Renata understood this even when he did not. They worked in the shorthand of 2 people who had built cases together before, not social conversation, not pleasantries, but the direct, efficient exchange of 2 legal minds that trust each other completely and have no time for the social overhead that trust usually requires to be established. Calvin was already there. He sat at the end of the table with his phone and his laptop, and the expression of a young man who has been doing something important and is waiting to find out if it was the right kind of important. He played the video for Diana, all 11 minutes and 47 seconds of it. She watched it without expression, which was itself an expression, the total stillness of someone translating what they are seeing directly into legal consequence, skipping the intermediate step of emotional reaction entirely. When it ended, she watched it again from the beginning. Then she set it down. This contradicts every material claim in Harlan's arrest report, she said. Every one, James confirmed. The permit being dropped is particularly useful. That's on camera. Clear, deliberate 11 seconds of footage showing an officer treating a valid city-issued document with contempt at a lawful funeral service. That's not just evidence of the wrongful arrest. That's character evidence. Calvin sent the file to Diana's secure server to James's cloud backup, and to a second device he kept for exactly this reason. He did not post it anywhere. He had not posted it anywhere. He had been very clear with the other mourners who had his number. Do not post the long version. The clips are out there, let them work. We are holding the master copy for the attorneys. Diana opened her legal pad. She wrote 3 headings across the top, and began filling each column. The first, a motion to dismiss the criminal charges on the grounds that no probable cause existed, that the gathering was lawfully permitted, and that the arrest itself was an illegal seizure. She would attach Calvin's video, James's sworn declaration, and affidavits from no fewer than 12 mourners, all of whom had witnessed the same sequence of events and whose accounts were identical because they were describing something that actually happened. The second, a civil complaint under Section 1983 of the United States Code, which allows private citizens to sue government officials for violations of their constitutional rights. The defendants, Harlan individually and in his official capacity, Shepard as a bystander officer who had a duty to intervene and did not, Pollard for supervisory liability and for ratifying the illegal conduct, and the city of Millfield for the policy and practice that had allowed Harlan to accumulate 5 complaints without discipline. The third, a formal complaint to the County Civilian Oversight Commission with a request for an emergency hearing. James added the fourth himself. "We file the civil suit in federal court," he said. He paused for a moment, letting Diana arrive at the implication on her own. She looked at him across the table. "You'd recuse yourself from your own case, obviously, immediately and completely. It goes to whichever judge draws the assignment through the standard rotation." He held her gaze. "But it lives in my courthouse. The case is filed in the United States District Court for the Southern District of Millfield, the building where I have worked for 16 years. That is where Bryce Harlan answers for what he did." Diana looked at him for one long moment. Then she wrote it down. Reverend Arthur Gaines arrived at 10 o'clock that morning, carrying a battered accordion folder that was held together with a length of twine wrapped twice around its girth. He had brought it from the church where it lived in the lower drawer of his desk, in the small office off the vestibule, the office where people came when they needed to tell something to someone who would not dismiss them, who would write it down, who would keep the paper. He placed the folder on the dining table with the careful reverence of a man delivering something that has been entrusted to him. "I've been keeping records," he said. He sat down. His voice was low and carried the weight of years of careful, deliberate restraint. 11 years. People in this community, when they have an experience with a certain officer, when they are afraid to go to the police about the police, they come to me. I write it down. I keep the paper. I've been waiting for the right moment to know what to do with it." He opened the folder. It contained 14 documented accounts, 14 separate incidents, each one recorded on a single sheet in Gaines's careful handwriting, with names, dates, locations, and descriptions of events. Each one had a supporting document attached, a photograph, a copy of a dismissed complaint, a notarized statement from the person involved. Diana went through them one by one. Her expression changed with each page, not dramatically, but in the way a face changes when it is receiving information that is altering its understanding of the magnitude of a problem. She became progressively stiller, the way very deep water is stiller than shallow water. A young woman, 23, illegally searched at a bus stop on the grounds that she matched a description of someone Harlan could not subsequently produce a description of. A formal complaint filed. Dismissed by Pollard's office, insufficient evidence. A shop owner's son, 17, roughed up while standing in front of his own father's store on a Tuesday afternoon. Cited for loitering on his father's private property. Complaint filed. Dismissed officer was responding to a neighbor's concern. An elderly man, 74, ticketed for a broken taillight and then subjected to a 20-minute traffic stop, during which Harlan had mocked his hearing aid, asked him repeatedly if he was intoxicated, and called for backup that arrived and then left when it became clear there was nothing to respond to. Complaint filed. Dismissed, no policy violation identified. 3 of the dismissal forms bore Pollard's signature. Diana set the last page down and looked at the table surface for a moment. "This isn't a wrongful arrest lawsuit anymore," she said. She looked up at James. "This is a pattern and practice case. This is Monell territory." She was referring to the landmark Supreme Court decision that allows municipalities to be sued for the unconstitutional practices of their employees when those practices reflect official policy or widespread custom. We can go after Harlan, Pollard, and the department, all three, for what they did to you and for what they have been doing in this community for years. James looked at the photographs in Gaines's folder. Faces he recognized, some from his neighborhood, some from court, some from Darius's youth center, where they had sat in folding chairs at community meetings and talked about the specific weight of living in a neighborhood where the institutions that were supposed to protect you had become the thing you needed protecting from. Darius would have known about Harlan. Darius had his ear pressed to the ground of this community every day in the gym and the hallways and the parking lot afterward where the real conversations happened. He would have known. And knowing Darius, he would have been collecting names, building a case of his own, pushing at it from the community side in the way that James pushed at things from the legal side. The thought arrived with such force and such specific grief that James had to set it aside immediately, or it would have taken him under. He set it aside. He came back. "We hold all of it accountable," he said. "Everything in that folder, every name, every date, every signature." He looked at Gaines. "Every person who brought you a story. We use it. They came to you because they thought no one with power was listening. We make sure someone with power was listening." Gaines looked at him. Something moved in the old man's eyes, relief possibly of the particular kind that comes from a long wait. He nodded once. The police union issued its statement at 2 p.m. on the day after the arrest. It was 11 sentences long and had clearly been written by someone with legal training, cautious in its specific claims, strategic in its framing, and entirely divorced from the events as they had actually occurred. Officer Harlan responded professionally and appropriately to a legitimate disturbance complaint. He was met at the scene with hostility and non-compliance from an individual who refused to identify himself and escalated the situation through aggressive verbal conduct. Officer Harlan followed departmental protocol at every step. The union stands behind Officer Harlan and calls on the public to withhold judgment until the facts are fully established. James read it at his kitchen table. He read it twice. He noted the specific constructions, refused to identify himself, false, and directly contradicted by footage. Escalated the situation through aggressive verbal conduct, false and directly contradicted by footage. Followed departmental protocol at every step, a claim that would not survive the legal test of what protocol actually required, but one that sounded authoritative to any audience that did not know what the protocol actually said. The narrative was being built. They had done it before, with the 14 people in Gaines's folder, and it had worked each time. The official version wins when there is no countervailing evidence. There was now countervailing evidence. Pollard gave a television interview that afternoon. He sat across from a local news anchor with the comfortable, practiced ease of a man who has given this interview in various forms many times before. He spoke in the measured cadence of institutional authority, unhurried, confident, slightly condescending, in the way of a man explaining something obvious to people he has decided are too emotional to see it clearly. Officer Harlan responded to a legitimate complaint and was met with a hostile crowd. He identified an individual who was actively obstructing his ability to address the situation and made the arrest judgment that was consistent with departmental guidelines. "We support Officer Harlan fully." Shepard watched the interview from his apartment. He had not gone in for his shift that morning. He had called in sick for the first time in 3 years of service. He sat on his couch in the dark of a Thursday afternoon in October and watched Pollard describe the afternoon at the cemetery in language that did not bear any recognizable relationship to the afternoon at the cemetery. He had been there. He had watched the permit hit the grass. He had heard James's steady, compliant voice saying, "I am not resisting," while Harlan's hands wrenched his arm. He had stood by the cruiser and held the crowd back and told himself that this was procedure, that this was how it worked, that Harlan was senior and experienced, and that there were things Shepard did not yet understand. He had been trying to believe that for 36 hours. He was finding it increasingly difficult. He did not sleep well that night. He did not sleep at all, really. He lay on his back in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about his older brother, who had been a cop in the next county over for 11 years, and who had told Craig when Craig was graduating from the academy, "The badge means something, Craig. It means you chose to be the person who shows up. Don't let anyone make you into someone who shows up for the wrong reasons." He thought about the permit on the grass. At 3 a.m., he got up, sat at his kitchen table, and wrote down in his own handwriting a complete and accurate account of everything he had witnessed at Millfield Memorial Cemetery. It arrived at Diana's office on day 5, a plain manila envelope, letter-sized, delivered by hand, not by courier, not by mail, but placed on the front desk of Welch and Associates by someone who had come through the lobby, set it down, and left before the receptionist finished her current call. No return address. James Caldwell's name on the front in block letters, inside a prepaid phone. On the phone, one text message. "I was there. I have the body cam footage from Harlan's unit before it was submitted. The file they submitted is not the original. I can document the difference. I cannot live with what I know. Tell me where to meet." Diana called James. She read him the message. There was a silence between them that lasted approximately 4 seconds and contained in its density a restructuring of everything they had understood the case to be. "Manage it carefully," James said. "Whoever this is, they're frightened. They've taken a significant risk. If we lose them permanently." Diana arranged a meeting at a diner in Carver County, 40 minutes south of Millfield, far enough to be anonymous, public enough to be safe. She went alone. She asked James specifically not to come. The presence of the man whose arrest was at the center of this would be too much for whoever was coming. She went alone, and she arrived 15 minutes early, and she sat in a booth facing the door, and she waited. Craig Shepard came through the door 12 minutes later. He was in civilian clothes, jeans, a dark jacket, a cap pulled low. He looked like a man who had checked his mirrors 4 times on the drive over and had still not entirely convinced himself he hadn't been followed. He was pale. The pallor was not performance. It was physiological. The specific color of a person whose nervous system has been running a sustained alarm for days without relief. He sat across from Diana. He looked at the table for a moment before he looked at her. Then he told her. He described the cemetery in the specific, accurate detail of a witness rather than a participant. The approach of the cruiser, the walk across the grass, the way Harlan's hand had gone to his weapon before he was even within conversation distance of anyone. He described the permit being dropped. He described James's compliance, verbal and physical, and the way it had enraged Harlan rather than satisfying him. He described the arrest. Then he described what happened afterward. "Harlan's body cam was running from the moment we pulled into the cemetery lot," Shepard said. His voice was low and very steady, the steadiness of a person who has made a decision and is now executing it cleanly, without room for second thoughts. It captured the whole approach, the whole thing. The permit. Everything. That footage, the original, was uploaded to the department's cloud server the same night. Standard procedure. He paused. What Harlan submitted to the department's evidence system 2 days later was not the original file. The first 43 seconds are gone. The file starts after Harlan was already in confrontation with the crowd. The approach, the walk across the grass, the permit being dropped, none of that is in the submitted version. Diana said nothing. She looked at him. Pollard sent a memo to the precinct the day after the arrest. Shepard continued. Precinct-wide. All reports related to the cemetery incident must be consistent with Officer Harlan's initial report. We need to present a unified account. Those are the exact words. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced 2 USB drives, which he set on the table between them. The first drive has the raw file, the original body cam footage pulled from the cloud backup server before the edited version replaced it. The second has the precinct email chain, Pollard's memo, text messages between Pollard and Harlan, direct messages. Make the charges stick. Say he threatened you. I will back us. He sat back slightly. He looked very tired. Why? Diana asked. It was one word, but it was the necessary word. Shepard looked at his hands. My brother is a cop, he said. He told me the badge means you chose to be the person who shows up, that you show up for the people. He was quiet for a moment. I saw what Harlan did to that man at the cemetery. I watched it happen. And then I watched Pollard write a different story about what happened. And I thought about every complaint in that precinct file that Pollard has dismissed for 9 years. And I thought, he stopped. He started again. I looked him up afterward. The man we arrested. I saw who he was. A federal judge. 16 years on the bench. And I thought, if they can do this to him with his resources and his knowledge and his ability to fight back, what have they been doing to people who don't have any of that? What did we do to those people? He looked up at Diana directly. I can't carry it anymore. Diana placed her hand on the table, not touching the drives, not touching him, just placing it on the table as a kind of anchor for the conversation. You understand what this means for you, she said. It was not a question. Yes, you will need immunity. I can get that for you, but you'll need to cooperate fully. Complete disclosure. Everything you know, not just what's on those drives. Yes. And you'll need to testify. Yes. He said it without hesitation. The hesitation she understood had ended when he sat down at his kitchen table at 3 a.m. and started writing. She took the drives. You're doing the right thing, she said. He gave a small, tired nod. Tell Judge Caldwell I'm sorry, for my part in it, for standing by the cruiser and not doing more. Diana looked at him. I'll tell him, she said. He'll want to hear that directly from you someday. Martin Cole had been doing digital forensic analysis for federal public defenders for 19 years. He was 52, methodical, and possessed of the specific kind of patience that comes from understanding that the truth is almost always in the data, and that the data does not lie if you read it correctly. He had testified in 41 federal cases. He had never been successfully impeached. Diana brought him both drives at 9 a.m., the morning after the diner meeting. She sat across from him in his small, intensely organized office and watched him work. He examined the submitted body cam file, first the version Harlan had provided to the department's evidence system. Then he pulled up the original from the cloud backup. He ran them side by side on 2 monitors. The cryptographic hash doesn't match, he said within 4 minutes of beginning the comparison. He said it the way a doctor names a diagnosis, not dramatically, just accurately. A cryptographic hash is essentially a mathematical fingerprint of a file. Every bit of data in the file is processed through an algorithm that produces a unique string of characters. If even one character in the file changes 1 bit anywhere, the hash changes completely. The 2 files have different hashes. They are not the same file. Can you document that in a form admissible in federal court? Diana asked, already generating the report. He kept working. But there's more. He pulled up a 3rd window, the metadata embedded in the submitted file. Every time a file is opened and saved on a specific computer, that machine leaves a device identifier in the metadata. It's like a fingerprint. Permanent. He highlighted a string of characters. This identifier is registered in the Millfield PD Equipment Registry. He opened a 4th window and cross-referenced. It belongs to a department-issued laptop assigned to Officer Bryce Harlan. The office was completely quiet. The edit was made on Harlan's laptop. Cole continued. 36 hours after the arrest, 14 hours after the video from the cemetery began circulating publicly. He looked at Diana, He saw the footage going viral. He knew people would request the body cam. He went into the file on his own department-issued laptop, cut the first 43 seconds, and submitted the edited version as the official record. He paused. That is evidence tampering in a federal proceeding. That is not a gray area. Diana called James from the parking lot outside Cole's office. She stood in the morning light, her phone pressed to her ear, and told him clearly and completely what Cole had found. The hash mismatch, the device identifier, the timestamp of the edit. 4 separate technical pillars, she said. Any one of them raises serious questions. All 4 together are bulletproof. James was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the quality it had in the courtroom, when he had heard enough testimony to make a finding of fact that he knew would not be revisited. File everything he said. Criminal referral to the U.S. Attorney. Copy to the FBI Civil Rights Division. And file the civil complaint in federal court today. Today. Today, he said, before they have time to prepare for it. The criminal arraignment on the obstruction charge against James was scheduled at the Millfield County Courthouse, a building that sits at the intersection of Court Street and Federal Plaza, directly across the plaza from the United States District Court for the Southern District of Millfield. James had walked between these 2 buildings hundreds of times. He knew every step of that plaza, every crack in the concrete, the specific slant of morning light that hit the federal building's entrance at 8:15 a.m. from October through February. He had never in 16 years approached the county courthouse as a defendant. Diana's motion to dismiss arrived at the county DA's office simultaneously with the forensic report, Shepard's signed affidavit, and Calvin's full video footage. The package was hand-delivered at 8 a.m. It was 17 pages of motion, 42 pages of exhibits, and a cover letter that was 2 paragraphs long and so precise in its language that it required no elaboration. The cover letter noted that copies had been delivered simultaneously to the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI's Civil Rights Division. It noted that a federal civil complaint had been filed under docket number that morning. It noted that the forensic analysis of the body cam footage had been completed by a certified expert whose findings were attached in full. The cover letter's final paragraph stated without drama, the Millfield Police Department submitted an edited body cam file bearing Officer Harlan's device identifier in connection with a criminal proceeding. This constitutes evidence tampering under 18 U.S.C. Section 1519. The obstruction charges against Judge Caldwell cannot survive the evidence attached hereto and must be dismissed immediately. The alternative proceeding, with a prosecution built on fabricated evidence, will be met with the full force of federal civil rights law. Pollard was called to the DA's office at 9:30 a.m. He sat across from Assistant DA Patricia Lund, who was 39 thorough and had been up since 5 a.m., reading Cole's forensic report with the focused attention of someone who understood with increasing clarity that she had been handed a case built on falsified evidence and that the falsification was now fully documented and had been submitted to federal authorities before her morning coffee was finished. She placed Cole's report on the table between them, open to the page with the hash analysis. She did not speak. She let him read it. Pollard read it. He read it again. His face did not collapse. He was too experienced for that, too practiced in the maintenance of the administrative expression that communicates authority and control regardless of what is happening underneath. But something in the structure of his face changed. The way a wall changes before it falls, not visibly, not dramatically, but at the level of load-bearing capacity. Something was no longer holding what it had been holding. Lund explained the hash mismatch in non-technical terms. She explained the device identifier. She explained the timestamp of the edit. She placed Shepard's affidavit beside the forensic report and let Pollard read the relevant paragraphs. Then she placed Pollard's own email. "We need one story. Make sure your reports are consistent before end of shift on the table beside everything else." Pollard said nothing. The DA's office is dismissing all charges against Judge Caldwell, Lund said. Effective immediately. The department will receive formal notification within the hour. She paused. And I think you should speak to an attorney, Gary. Not the union's attorney. Your own. The charges against James were dropped at 10:17 a.m. in a two-sentence statement from the DA's office, citing material discrepancies in the evidentiary record that render the charges unsustainable. It was a quiet retreat, clinical in its language, cowardly in its ambiguity. It named no one, acknowledged nothing, apologized for nothing. Harlan was in the courthouse when the statement was released. He was in the lobby waiting to speak with the union representative who had been assigned to his case. The union rep received the notification on his phone and read it, and then read it again. And then he looked up at Harlan and told him what it said. And then he told Harlan what the forensic report said. And then he told Harlan whose name was on the device identifier in the body cam metadata. And then he said, Bryce, you know who that man is, the man you arrested. Harlan said he knew his name. His name, the union rep said, and his title. He is a United States District Judge. He has worked in the federal courthouse across that plaza for 16 years. He looked at Harlan steadily. The case number on the civil complaint filed this morning. The civil complaint that names you as the primary defendant for constitutional violations is assigned to this district. His district. He paused. He's recused himself from his own case, obviously, but it lives in his building. You answer for this in his building. The courthouse lobby was its ordinary Thursday self. People moving through security clerks, crossing with folders, attorneys in conversation by the elevators. The ordinary business of justice proceeding at its normal pace. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Harlan stood in the middle of it and went very still. He thought about the man at the graveside who had not turned around when he spoke, who had kept his hand on the casket and his composure intact through everything that followed, who had stated his own name, just his name, James Caldwell, quietly and without flinching, as if the name itself were sufficient authority, as if it had always been sufficient authority, and Harlan had simply failed to understand that yet. He was beginning to understand it now. Diana held the press conference at 2 p.m. on the steps of the United States District Court for the Southern District of Millfield. She had chosen the location with the deliberateness she applied to everything. Not the county courthouse, not a neutral space, not a hotel conference room. The federal courthouse. The building where James had worked for 16 years. The building whose name was carved in stone above the entrance in letters that had been there since before Harlan joined the force. The building that the civil complaint filed that morning had made the arena for everything that came next. She stood at a portable podium set up on the courthouse steps. Behind her, the building's carved stone facade. To her left, Renata Caldwell in dark blue, her posture carrying the same composed fury that had brought her to the precinct waiting room the afternoon before, now given a larger stage. To her right, Reverend Gaines carrying himself with the particular gravity of a man who has been patient for 11 years and is now watching the moment he has been patient for arrive. Between them, Calvin with his phone and his footage, and the specific quiet pride of someone who was there and did not look away. James was not on those steps. Diana had been clear with him. You are not the combatant in this moment. You are the subject and the principle and the evidence. The system will speak for itself, and your absence is louder than your presence would be. He agreed. He was at home. He watched the first 3 minutes on his laptop, and then closed the screen because watching served no useful purpose, and there was still work to be done, and the work was its own form of dignity. The plaza filled. 14 cameras. Reporters from the state's 3 major papers, 2 national outlets whose local correspondents had been following the video since it went viral. A crowd of community members that included many of the mourners from the cemetery and many of the people from Gaines's folder who had come because someone had finally called them and told them it was time. Diana played Calvin's footage on a large screen erected to the left of the podium. 11 minutes and 47 seconds. The crowd in the plaza watched it in silence. The cruiser arriving too fast. The walk across the grass. The permit being dropped. The grab the handcuffs. James's voice saying clearly and repeatedly, "I am not resisting." When it ended, the plaza was so quiet that the sound of traffic on Federal Plaza was audible. Then she played the first 43 seconds of the unedited body cam footage. No music, no disturbance, no aggression. A group of people in dark clothes standing at an open grave in the October afternoon, their faces carrying the ordinary devastation of grief. A permit lying on the grass. The approach of an officer who had made his decision before he finished crossing the lawn. A reporter in the front row made a sound involuntary brief. Then silence again. Diana read from Pollard's email. She read the words aloud in the open air of the plaza in front of the cameras, in front of the community, in front of the courthouse. We need one story. Make sure your reports are consistent before end of shift. And then, from the text message chain between Pollard and Harlan, make the charges stick. Say he threatened you. I will back us. She set the papers down. This was not a misunderstanding, she said. Her voice was controlled and carrying, and did not require drama, because the facts she had just presented had already done everything that drama could have done, and more. This was not a failure of judgment or a breakdown in training. This was a deliberate, coordinated violation of a man's constitutional rights at his son's graveside, followed by a criminal conspiracy to fabricate evidence and file false reports in order to cover it up. She paused. As the documentation provided by Reverend Gaines demonstrates, documentation accumulated over 11 years from members of this community who were told again and again that their experiences did not rise to the level of official concern. This was not an isolated event. This was a pattern, a long protected and deliberately concealed pattern of abuse of authority directed at Black and brown residents of this city by Officer Harlan, enabled by Lieutenant Pollard, and shielded by a department culture that treated accountability as optional. She looked directly at the cameras. We are not here today to demand justice for a federal judge. We are here to demand accountability for a broken institution. The judge was the person with the resources and the knowledge to fight back. Behind him are 14 other people who did not have those resources and were told their experiences didn't matter. They matter. Every one of them matters. And this case will say so on the record in federal court. The plaza erupted. The U.S. Attorney's Office opened a criminal investigation 48 hours after the press conference. The announcement was 3 paragraphs long and named no defendants specifically, which was standard for an ongoing investigation, and which satisfied no one, but was procedurally correct. And procedural correctness was a thing James had spent 16 years caring about, because it was the only thing standing between justice and the exercise of raw institutional power. He cared about it now, even when it meant waiting. He did not have to wait long. The FBI's Civil Rights Division, working from Diana's federal complaint and from Gaines's 11 years of documentation, announced a pattern and practice inquiry into the Millfield Police Department within the same week. The inquiry would examine hiring practices, use of force policies, complaint, processing procedures, and the specific handling of internal affairs complaints involving Officer Harlan and Lieutenant Pollard, going back to the beginning of Pollard's supervisory tenure, 8 years. 8 years. James read the announcement and thought of the 14 faces in Gaines's folder. 8 years of documented complaints. 8 years of dismissal forms with Pollard's signature. The math of what had gone unaddressed in this city, on these streets, in these neighborhoods over 8 years, was the kind of calculation that stayed with a person. The Millfield police chief held a press conference 4 days after the FBI announcement. He stood at a podium in the department's media room and read a statement that he had clearly not written himself, The passive constructions and strategic ambiguities of a document written by lawyers appearing in almost every sentence. He expressed the department's full cooperation with the federal inquiry. He expressed his personal commitment to transparency and accountability. He expressed at the end his intention to retire, citing his long service and his desire to spend more time with his family. He did not mention Harlan. He did not mention Pollard. He did not mention the 14 people in Gaines's folder. He did not, in any of the careful lawyered sentences of his statement, acknowledge that anything in particular had happened, or that anyone in particular had caused it. He left his own press conference through a side door. The police union, which had issued a statement praising Harlan's professionalism 11 days before, issued a new statement expressing its deep concern about the allegations that had come to light and its full support for a complete and transparent investigation. The statement did not mention the previous statement. It was released at 4:47 p.m. on a Friday, which is the time an institution releases things it hopes will be read as little as possible. Pollard was arrested at his home on a Tuesday morning at 6:14 a.m. He came to the door in the clothes he had slept in, a gray t-shirt and track pants, his reading glasses pushed up on his head. The federal agents were in 2 vehicles parked at the curb with their lights off. The street was quiet. The specific quiet of a residential neighborhood at 6 a.m. In the fall leaves on the pavement, the distant sound of a dog, the cold clarity of dawn light that makes everything look simultaneously ordinary and definitive. He was read his rights on his own front porch. His neighbor's lights came on in 1s and 2s. He was placed in the vehicle. The vehicles pulled away from the curb and down the street at the speed of no particular urgency, because there was no particular urgency. He was already in custody, and the day had already begun, and everything that came next would proceed at the pace of federal process, which is deliberate and thorough and does not hurry. Harlan was found at the precinct locker room at 9:30 a.m. that same Tuesday. He was changing after his shift. The 2 federal agents who entered the locker room were not in uniforms. They were in suits, which communicated a great deal in a police locker room, where the social grammar of clothing is understood completely. Harlan looked at them when they came through the door, and the look on his face went through 3 things in approximately 2 seconds: recognition of what they were, calculation of whether there was any way out of this, and the abandonment of that calculation. He started to speak. He cited his union representative. He began a sentence that might have been a protest or a question. The lead agent, a woman 40 with the particular quality of stillness that comes from 15 years in federal law enforcement and a complete absence of interest in the performance of authority, cut him off with 2 words delivered in a voice that contained no affect at all. Mr. Harlan, not officer, not the title, just the name, just a man's name spoken in a locker room. You have the right to remain silent, she said. I strongly advise you to use it. She read him the full Miranda warning. Her partner produced the handcuffs. They were the same model used throughout the Millfield Police Department. The same steel, the same weight, the same mechanism. The cuffs closed around Harlan's wrists, with the sound that handcuffs make, that particular ratcheting click, that is the same in every precinct, every county, every jurisdiction in the country. The sound of a mechanism doing its function. He was walked out of the locker room through the hallway that ran the length of the 4th Precinct's operational floor. It was the same hallway he had walked James Caldwell through 6 weeks before. The same linoleum, the same overhead lights, the same doors. There were officers in that hallway, on their way to and from the bullpen, pausing with coffee cups turning from the copy machine. Officers who had been present on the day Harlan came in with James Caldwell. Officers who had watched with expressions ranging from indifference to amusement as a well-dressed black man was walked through in handcuffs. None of them were smiling now. The hallway was quiet in the way that a space becomes quiet when everyone present is making a choice not to speak. Not because there is nothing to say, but because everything that could be said has already been communicated by the event itself. Harlan walked through it with his eyes forward and his chin level, not from dignity, because dignity is a thing you earn through the choices you make. And Harlan's choices were now fully on record, but from the mechanical forward motion of someone who has run out of alternatives. He was put in a federal vehicle and driven to the federal courthouse on Federal Plaza, the federal courthouse where the civil complaint bearing his name as the primary defendant lived on the docket, the federal courthouse where James Caldwell had worked for 16 years. The arraignment was held the next morning. Harlan and Pollard were brought into the federal courtroom in the orange jumpsuits of federal detainees, their wrists shackled, their ankles shackled the chain between wrist and ankle, imposing a specific constrained way of moving that requires attention and produces inevitably a bowed quality to the carriage that is not humility but resembles it. The courtroom was full. Renata was in the third row between Reverend Gaines and Diana. Calvin sat at the end of the row. James was not there. He had decided this deliberately, and he had decided it correctly. His presence would have made the arraignment about him, and the arraignment was not about him. It was about what had been done to the 14 people in Gaines's folder, and to everyone who had not found their way to Gaines's office. It was about what the law said happened when authority was used to destroy the people it existed to protect. The magistrate judge presiding was a colleague of James's, a woman named Judge Frances Okafor, who had been on the federal bench for 11 years, and who approached the bench with the particular composed authority of someone who has spent a decade and a half being the most serious person in whatever room she occupies. She read the charges. Evidence tampering under 18 U.S.C. Section 1519. Conspiracy to obstruct justice. Filing false police reports. Civil rights violations under color of law. She read them without inflection because the charges carried their own weight and did not require the addition of hers. The federal prosecutor requested detention, flight risk, and danger to the community based on Pollard's access to witnesses and his demonstrated willingness to use institutional authority to suppress testimony. Judge Okafor considered it for 11 seconds. Then she said, "Bail is denied." The gavel came down. Shepard, whose cooperation had been the foundation of the federal criminal case, was granted immunity 2 weeks later. He had already resigned from the force. He had applied to a paralegal program at a local college. He was 28 years old and had, at significant personal cost, done the thing that the 14 people in Gaines's folder had not been able to do. He had stood inside the institution and told the truth about it on the record at the moment when it mattered. That was not nothing. It was not absolution. But it was not nothing. The 3 dismissed complaints bearing Pollard's signature were formally reopened by the county's Civilian Oversight Board within 30 days. Each of the 3 individuals whose complaints had been dismissed received a letter informing them that their cases were under federal review. For at least 2 of them, James understood from what he had been told. The letter was the first time an official institution had communicated to them that their experiences had been real and documented, and that someone with authority was now taking them seriously. He thought about what it meant to receive that letter. He thought about how long they had waited for it. James filed the civil lawsuit from his own courthouse, recused himself immediately and formally through the standard judicial procedure, and let the case proceed to a randomly assigned judge without further involvement. The city settled 61 days after the complaint was filed. The settlement figure was not disclosed publicly, which was standard, and which James had not fought because the number was not the point. The point was the federal docket number. The point was the deposition transcripts. The point was that Harlan and Pollard and the city of Millfield had answered for what was done at Millfield Memorial Cemetery in the United States District Court for the Southern District of Millfield, in the building where James Caldwell had spent 16 years of his life, and that the record of that answering was permanent and public, and could not be edited or crumpled and dropped on the grass. He put the full settlement amount into a fund he named the Darius Caldwell Foundation for Community Justice. The Foundation's two programs a scholarship for residents of the city's South Side pursuing careers in public service. Teachers, social workers, community planners, and a legal assistance program providing representation at no cost to residents who faced civil rights violations and could not afford an attorney. The work Darius would have done, advocating and building and pushing from the inside of communities that needed someone to show up consistently, James would now do with the resources that the system had delivered to him by mistake. He thought Darius would have appreciated the irony of that. He thought Darius would have appreciated it in the specific way that Darius appreciated irony, with a wide, bright grin and a comment about the universe having a sense of humor after all. On a Saturday morning, 7 weeks after the funeral, James and Renata drove to Millfield Memorial Cemetery. The October that had held the day of the funeral was gone. November had arrived with its particular clarity, the light thinner and more directional. The trees mostly bare the sky, a pale and specific blue that carried no ambiguity. They had been back once since the funeral, briefly, practically to approve the headstone placement. This was different. This was the first time they had come with no agenda, except to be there in the quiet together. The grass had grown back over the disturbed earth, a seamless green carpet, as if the ground had healed itself in the ordinary way of things that have been disrupted and then given time and weather. The headstone was simple and elegantly proportioned, the lettering clean, Darius James Caldwell, beloved son. He showed up. Those had been Renata's words, and they were exactly right. They were more right than any longer inscription would have been. Renata had known that the way she knew the difference between black and charcoal, the way she knew which things needed to be said plainly and which things needed to be said not at all. She knelt and placed a bouquet of sunflowers, not chrysanthemums, not lilies, but sunflowers, yellow and direct and facing forward, because those had been his color and his orientation and his whole approach to the world. James stood beside her with his hand on her shoulder and felt the grief which was still there and would always be there, but which had changed in its quality over the 7 weeks since the cemetery had been a place of chaos and violation. It was no longer a wound being reopened. It was a weight he was learning to carry. There was a difference, as his father had told him once, between surviving and carrying. He was beginning to understand that distinction from the inside. He looked at the patch of grass where he had been handcuffed. It was just grass now, indistinguishable from any other section of the lawn, ordinary and green and growing. The place had been reclaimed by time and weather, and the ordinary continuation of the world, which does not pause for violations, even when violations are grievous. He thought about that for a moment. He thought about the word reclaimed, what it meant for a place to be taken back, not by erasure, because nothing was erased, but by the accumulation of different moments in the same space, until the space belonged to something larger than the worst thing that had happened there. He thought Darius would have understood that. Darius had spent 3 years in neighborhoods that had been defined by their worst moments, and his entire career had been an argument that a place is not its worst moment, that a place is what the people who love it choose to build there. That was the argument James intended to carry forward. That was the promise. He would carry it in the foundation bearing his son's name, in the opinions he would write, with a different understanding of what it meant to be inside the machine. He had always tried to make run right in the 16 or 20, or however many years of service remained to him. He would carry it the way his father had said, you carry the things that don't go away, not by pretending they are lighter than they are, but by deciding that you are strong enough to hold them and keep moving anyway, on his own terms, towards something, in no hurry, on ground that belonged to him as much as it belonged to anyone. If these stories of justice and dignity resonate with you, please like and subscribe to our channel. We'll see you in the next one.